It's the Yukon Popcast. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we have a special guest today. We are honoured, delighted, excited, and lots of other words to be joined by Professor Rob Farley.
Professor Robert Farley from the University of Kentucky.
Professor Robert Farley, University of Kentucky, and author of a very well-regarded article on the Star Wars streaming series Andor, which we're going to talk about today. Your article, Professor, Andor recreates the Battle of Algiers, and it works.
Yes. And those are words I still hold to this very day.
Okay, so we're going to get into it today. We're going to discuss the Disney Plus streamer. The first season is, a little bit in the past, but there has just been a release
just today.
Yeah, trail. Well, you've seen it today. It's actually a couple of weeks old. I told you about it today. A release of a trailer for season 2, which you guys, I saw it this morning and told you guys about it, and you guys have literally just watched it on the phone now.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts, chaps, on the trailer?
Well, I think it's awfully interesting that they seem to be drawing the series much tighter into the Star Wars universe. The first season is very self-contained in terms of its characterizations and is detached from a lot of stuff that's happening in Star Wars. But the second season trailer brings in the Emperor, seems to bring in Darth Vader, brings in other figures who are going to be familiar to a lot of folks who are sort of more generally familiar with the Star Wars mythos, but even some that are more obscure, like Ezra Bridger. Yeah. That's interesting, but it's also worrying at the same time that they may be not working to the strength of the presentation.
Yeah, and one of the things that Rob had mentioned that is interesting is that we see neither Cyril nor Deidre in the trailer. So I have still a pretty high degree of confidence that they will be important parts of season 2, but it is a little worrying.
Well, they'd invested so much time in developing those characters, and they're very specific characters. It would be astonishing to, Cyril is the kind of striving sort of Malcop supervisor who screws it all up and gets kind of bombed out. And then he sort of fixates on, what's she called? Dedra. Who's a ISB supervisor, which is a position of great sort of prominence and interest, certainly to Cyril. Somewhat, what is his interest? Is it,
Okay, so he says the thing...
Is it Freudian or is it erotic or what's...
Well, the thing that he claims draws her so tightly, draws him so tightly to Dedra is that they are both great believers in order. That order is the most important thing, and they will each do anything in order to establish and maintain order. Okay. Now, this is his take. I'm not sure if that's also true for Dedra or not. I think Dedra might be more complicated than that.
Yeah, right. But she's like the successful version of him.
Right. It feels like there's clearly this creepy but romantic undertone to his interest in her, and I think we're going to get more to this. But it's absolutely fascinating that he's so committed to order, and he seems to find it a good idea to begin stalking a high-ranking intelligence officer of the Galactic Empire, right? That's where this particular thing leads him. He's an awfully interesting character. But we're here to talk about Andor, aren't we?
Yeah, that's true. Well, the whole thing. So the premise of your piece, Professor Farley, Andor recreates the Battle of Algiers, but in space. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Maybe what the Battle of Algiers is? How it relates to Andor?
Sure. So, as I think a lot of people are familiar, the Battle of Algiers is a 1960s era docudrama, which is almost entirely, and I think it may be 100%. There may be a few scenes which are actual documentary rather than cinematic, but it looks like a documentary, and it follows a few figures within the Algerian Revolution, the Algerian Civil War between the French and the Algerian resistance. It particularly focuses on the figure of Ali Lapointe, who begins essentially as a thug mercenary, goes to prison, is radicalized, and then becomes a key figure in the Algerian resistance. The style of the filming, the way in which the characters interact, and in some cases, literally events are lifted from Battle of Algiers and then are replayed in some fashion in Andor, and sometimes much longer arcs, sometimes much more briefly. But to give us like a super brief, and this, I appreciate this gets a little bit meta, but the Battle of Algiers begins at the end, right, where Ali Lapointe and a few other people are locked in this tiny room waiting for the French to come in and kill them. you begin to watch Andor, and it seems to start with Cassian Andor on a planet looking for his sister. He shoots 2 people, etc. But if you have watched the media that he is in that precedes Andor, the series, it's Rogue One. And so you know when you start that the man we're talking about here is already dead. And that is an interesting parallel between how LaPointe is depicted in Battle of Algiers and how Andor is going to be depicted across this entire, that we already know his entire arc and where he ends up from the very start of the fiction. And back when that piece was written, I caught a little bit of flack, and people were saying, oh, this is just another person, another academic attempting to impose a certain understanding. But it's explicit, right? There's nothing accidental about this relationship here between Battle of Algiers and Andor. There's so much that is so directly lifted that Gilroy is not doing this accidentally. It's very clear that he's trying to reimagine and reinvent the Battle of Algiers and simply place it into a Star Wars context.
Yeah, so it's a super interesting piece, and I think we're going to get into the details. Do you want me to explain the Threap Framework now, Jeff, or did you have a particularly pressing point you wanted to make?
I was just going to say, as an example of this borrowing of text and inspiration of text, I'm thinking of the bomb making scene and the final episode of Andor season 1, which seems almost beat by beat lifted from Battle of Algiers.
Right. Right. And the Jafar character is loosely interpreted into the Luthian character in Andor, but has many of the same concerns, right? That sort of the personal safety is put at risk by information and the transfer of information, and that's his motivating characteristic pretty much all through Andor. So it is a deeply ambitious project to try to recreate the Battle of Algiers in this particular mythology. And it's remarkable that it's so effective, or that I found it so effective anyway.
Absolutely. Absolutely fascinating. We have a 3-part framework here on the Yukon podcast in which we use to address a particular text. We start at the textual level. How would you describe that level, Jeff?
Sometimes we call it the surface level. Sometimes we call it the level of plot. Sometimes we call it the level of authorial intention. The idea here is that we're trying to read this text to understand what its plain meanings are for the author. What does the author hope to get across in a relatively straightforward way?
Yeah, it's my kind of level. This is the simplistic, obvious, hit you over the head, and yet I still can't figure it out type of thing.
Well, what we've found over our time doing this is that certain texts are more or less straightforward, even at this level of authorial intention. And, I think what Rob just suggested is that this is a more complicated text, precisely because the intertextual references are almost certainly intentional.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's level 1, text or surface level. We then have a second level, which we call mythologies. And we tend to think of these as the sort of societal or cultural meaning structures that audiences might bring to the text that are going to be important in decoding what's in the text. So if the first level, is about authorial intention or a deliberate encoding of meaning into the text, the second level mythologies is more about decoding, and that process, which is not always a straightforward, or not ever a straightforward process. It can really vary across audiences. And then finally, we get to the deepest of the deep levels, our level of critique, where we talk about how the text maybe offers a different vision for life or destabilizes the taken for granted, or we address the way that critics have received Andor, and Andor's been, I think, critically pretty well received. Yes. So that's a 3-part framework. Gentlemen, would you like to get into the first part?
We would.
Yeah. Okay, and we will be right back with that. And we are back with our discussion of Andor with our very special guest, Professor Rob Farley. We're into the section now that we call text, or things that are on the surface. And, Rob, you'd started to explain some of the parallels between Andor and Battle of Algiers. They're both stories of, I think, the methods of constructing or organizing an insurgency, not just the kind of will to rebel, but actually some of the mechanics of, in some senses, literally how you would assemble bombs, but how you would assemble an insurgency, the mechanics of making that happen. And the other interesting textual thing, I think, in both cases, in the case of Andor and in the case of Battle of Algiers, is that this is a story that's told from both sides. You know, in Battle of Algiers, you see the resistance movements and the colonial, police force and army. And in Andor, similarly, you know, you're taken into the empire or the republic which is it? Is it I always get confused. Is it the empire at that point, or is it still the dying days of the republic?
Andor begins, and I think we may return to this, but in a timeline sense, Andor begins essentially during the waning years of the Republic.
Okay, that's right.
But most of the action happens during the later years of the Empire.
Yeah, and so we see the side in Andor of the budding resistance and the oppressive machinery. So what do you make of those parallels? You think those are not accidental, right? That's what I took from your piece and what you were saying earlier.
No, and I think were you to go back and watch Battle of Algiers, which I understand you did last night, or quite recently.
Preparation in the pod trade.
Much as is the case with the Star Wars universe writ large, the most impressive and interesting figure in Battle of Algiers is a villain. Right, it is Colonel Matu, who is the French colonel who arrives, explains what the French are doing in Algeria. He replaces a previous bureaucracy. But what sort of really impresses the viewer from when you are watching a Battle of Algiers is just how remarkable visually of a figure he is, right? That he is in some sense admirable. He's exciting. He's interesting. He's, arguably sexy in some ways. And I think we are getting perhaps a little bit into the myth here, but what Andor really does, which most previous Star Wars material has sort of captured that apex level villain. Right. And Star Wars is notable for sort of its ability to capture that apex level villain, whether it is Darth Maul or Kylo Ren or Darth Vader, right, and to make those very interesting figures. But as you suggest, what Andor is doing here is actually showing not only these mechanics of the rebellion, which include such things as recruiting, right, developing basic trust in a small team, figuring out what happens when there's a mechanical malfunction on the starship that you're supposed to be stealing. What happens when you randomly get picked up by a stormtrooper sweep, right? All of those are part of the rebellion side. But we also get a very clear picture of the imperial bureaucracy, right? Of the challenges that the imperial security and intelligence services face, of how they operate, of the sorts of personalities who operate as middle managers within that kind of bureaucracy, and the rivalries that they have and the challenges that they have. It's not only evocative of sort of what I think of as in sort of an American television and fiction pop culture history, sort of the middle manager moment, which I associate with Battlestar Galactica and The Office, and a few other shows that are sort of along that level. But it also tells us sort of really something about how the Empire functions on a daily basis, which we had never really gotten. Why does somebody become an Imperial officer? Well, we know more now than we did before. And that itself is, it has this relationship with the Battle of Algiers, but it also tells us a lot of really interesting stuff about the Star Wars universe and how we apply political logics and bureaucratic logics to sort of any sort of real-life parallels that we want to make.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that. I mean, it strikes me as you were talking that the analog in Andor of the Colonel Matu character from the Battle of Algiers is Dedra. Right. Who is visually striking, who is a bit of more of a tactician, for sure, I think, than she comes across originally. She's not the sort of bumbling bureaucrat that Cyril sort of comes across as. And her maneuvering her strategic maneuvering starts with outmaneuvering her colleagues in the ISB, and only later is it applied to the ostensible point of her job, right, which is kind of collecting intelligence and then stamping out a potential insurgent rebellion. So that's really interesting to me. And the other point, and Stephen, you and I are both big fans of the original The Office, the BBC version. And It's a really interesting analog there as well, because part of what's happening, a lot of what seems to be happening in this depiction of the empire is the kind of bumbling through on a daily basis of archaic and strange institutional logics, jurisdictional lines, as Dedra reminds her superiors, that exist only in the minds of the empire and nowhere else, and that actually don't make any sense. It's all this kind of hallmark of bureaucratic politics and the inefficiencies, the ironic inefficiencies of bureaucratic practice, when bureaucracies are, of course, originally intended to organize efficiencies.
Yeah, it's super interesting because in both Battle of Algiers, on both sides, you're shown, in both texts on both sides, you're shown the very different modes of organization that are going to suit the goals of the organization that's trying to achieve them. I'm not sure I explained that very well, so let me give the specific example. Like in Battle of Algiers, you're shown how the insurgent group operates by, people don't know the whole structure and everyone's kept apart from it. And that's paralleled in Andor, Luthen's very careful who he reveals his kind of identity to and who knows each other and who doesn't know each other. And then again, in both texts, the oppressive organization is organized very differently, but equally sort of interestingly, and it's super fascinating to see Dedra outmaneuver her contemporaries or her rivals on the what would you call it, like the ISB council, or and they have what's his name, Pardagaz, who's just this great sort of classic Star Wars villain, and he's clearly like setting all these people at each other's throats. And so there's the methodology for the repressive organization is not to hide the individual people from each other. It's to set them at each other's throat, and then they're going to compete and please Pardagaz, who himself, I imagine, is competing to please other people within the bureaucracy.
Right, and some of those scenes from the ISB, a lot of those scenes from the ISB are something that would be completely in place in a show like Slow Horses, or a show like Sandbaggers, or Homeland, right? Lots of different accounts of how the intelligence community functions. Right, there is in the American intelligence community there's no parallel to all of these people sitting around in a room and having this big conversation, but there's parallels to a lot of the smaller conversations.
Yeah.
And there is, and I'm sure you guys will appreciate this because you've probably said it yourself at some point during your careers. One of my favorite lines, and I believe the final episode, after the Empire has just killed an entire rebel group that essentially they were able to ambush, Dedra is so disappointed because there are no people left to interrogate. And she says, there needs to be a voice in the room that says we need to keep these people alive. Right now, you probably haven't said exactly, but you probably have said or heard something like, there needs to be a voice in the room at this academic endeavor or whatever, this bureaucratic endeavor, to express so that people are reminded that our organization has this as a priority. And it's just sort of an awfully well-timed and well-honed and well-thought-out way to interject that particular bureaucratic reality into how the Empire is functioning.
Yeah, the Empire lacked subtlety, I think. That was always the case in Star Wars. There's not a lot of like John le Carre-esque schemes that are I mean, the Rebellion's the only one that really ever displays any sort of subtlety. And I think it is actually brought up in Andor, maybe directly or it's alluded to, that this is just one of their weaknesses. It's very direct, the sort of arrogance of these people. It's something Cassian Andor says while he's in prison, that they're obviously not listening to us because they don't think we're anything to worry about. Which I wonder if, I was watching that and I was thinking, this does solve the massive plot hole here, which is these people need to organize a rebellion in a facility in which it's totally obvious they would be under constant surveillance. Yeah. So you needed to kind of explain away why they were not being listened to all the time.
But also because it allows the under-resourcing of those prison facilities, right, which the commanding officers announced to the new prisoners immediately. You're wondering why we don't carry weapons. How are we going to possibly, and we're so outnumbered. There's 3 of us and there's a whole gaggle of you. And it's because of the technology that they're relying upon, which on one hand is spectacularly efficient. On the other hand, it's incredibly easy to disable.
Yeah.
And when it's disabled, the whole thing.
which is the Empire in a nutshell, right? In the whole saga, and the fundamental problem they have of trying to administer or trying to control in a totalitarian way a territory that's so vast and diverse.
To drag in another conversation, I do have to wonder if Deloitte, if the imperial counterpart of a consulting firm came into the prisons on Narkina 5 and says, you can do without these people and these people, and then these two can be pulled together. You don't need to hire more employees for this, right?
And here's your new software program, which just so happens to electrocute all of the prisoners.
Right.
Look how
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, the other, another textual feature that I don't know how deep you want to go into this, or we just want to note it, but of both Battle of Algiers and Andor, and it's something that Battle of Algiers, if not pioneered, was part of the sort of first movement of, is the notion of a kind of neo-realist, in filmic terms, documentary style. Something that's a work of fiction but looks like it's shot like a newsreel, which is sort of Battle of Algiers' signature sort of textual element or visual element. And it's been utilized in a lot of science fiction since, and Andor does it particularly effectively. I know, Rob, you're a fan of Battlestar Galactica, as I am. It was a signature element of Battlestar Galactica, was that kind of handheld documentary style. Other works of science fiction, Children of Men, also kind of encompass that. It does give it's particularly appropriate, I think, for Andor, because this is a story that's been told through the eyes and through the actions of ordinary people. Like it's an on the ground story. Maybe this is more for our second section, myth. It's not princesses and the Force and so forth. It's ordinary people living their lives. So I just wanted to note that point, unless there's further commentary on that.
I mean, and this too we may want to revisit this in the myth section. In some ways, and this is no longer available to modern people who watch this universe. But if you recollect, back before Star Wars was refurbished, the original New Hope, before it was refurbished, there was this grittiness to the first half of the original Star Wars. It's not handheld cameras, it's not neorealism, but it is small people living in dirty places, doing dirty things without sort of really any hope of improving themselves. And so a lot of that has been washed away because George Lucas wanted to wash it away because he didn't want things to look gritty. But if you go back and find that, there's more commonality there. And Battle of Algiers is 68 and A New Hope is 77. So there's not even that much distance between those two films. And so I think that there is sort of more of a heritage there than I think a lot of people in Star Wars would be willing to admit.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
That's a great point. You guys had talked offline without me, which is astonishingly rude. But anyway, apparently things do happen in the world which I'm not present to observe, and
it was a mistake, an honest mistake.
Had to reluctantly admit that. But you guys had talked about the construction of Andor, the fact that it's made up of mini arcs. I actually saw another podcast, and again, this was stunning. They do exist. There are in fact. Did you know in 2024 there are several dozen podcasts available at least?
Yeah, but people shouldn't listen to
this one.
But I did by mistake, and they made the point that the Andor, the series, actually is sort of 3 movies, if you like, that are sort of aesthetically very different from one another, as well as telling different story arcs. You guys had also pointed to some of the ways that Tony Gilroy, the showrunner, had sort of set his plot in motion or got his characters away. So, talk to me about the construction of the story.
Yeah, so it is. It's made up of these mini arcs. We counted them out last night. We count 4.5, I think, is what we counted.
4.5, yeah.
And you're right that each of these arcs has a distinct feel and almost a distinct genre piece. You think about the raid on Aldhani, for example. That's a classic kind of heist story,
Yes. Right?
With all of your standard genre points. Right? You've got
don't quite trust each other.
Don't trust each other. Everybody's got a slightly different job. Everyone's a kind of specialist at one thing or another.
There's an inside man.
There's always an inside man. It sort of works. I mean, it does work, right? But at a very heavy cost. There's more in common with a movie like Ocean's 11 in this arc than there is, with a standard Star Wars story.
Yeah.
And all of them are like that. Think about the prison arc, right? Which is
the Great Escape.
Yeah, which is kind of points to escape plots of many sorts. It also has some kind of like forced labor, right, elements. So there's kind of a slavery movie that's kind of embedded in there as well. And then our final arc, which is where everybody comes back together, is I don't know, kind of almost like a kind of a classic rebellion movie, right?
Maybe like what's that movie called? The Battle of Algiers.
That one exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that we the first arc, which I think you can watch this one time and not really notice what's going on. But the first 3 episodes were used simply to edit them slightly differently and have a sort of a slightly different focus. This would be a police procedural.
A buddy cop
movie. It would be,
say.
It would be a buddy cop movie with Cyril Karn and his friend, the sergeant.
Sergeant Moscow.
Where you have 2 cops who are legitimately chasing a murderer, right? That when Cassian Andor opens the series through the cold-blooded murder of 2 security officials, and so you have these buddy cops who are actually taking all the steps that they need to take in order to track him down on another planet. They hunt him down there. They organize a big raid. I mean, this is all stuff that we have seen in buddy cop films, and it's very interesting to me that Gilroy is able to sneak in that little buddy cop movie in a way that people don't even really notice that that's what they're watching because we're cheering for the other guy, right? But that we have that genre in that first arc is just fascinating.
I think you guys wanted to talk about Tony Gilroy's strategies of kind of putting the plot together or the characters together.
Yeah, so Gilroy has said on multiple occasions that one of the toughest parts, maybe the most difficult part of telling this kind of ensemble story is making sure that you figure out a way to get the characters back together at some point. And here, that some point is the final episode of the season. And for Gilroy, the big challenge is doing it in a way that makes it seem like it's natural, like these things would actually occur and they don't feel forced. And it strikes me that he's aided in that quest by the way that the series and the season is broken up into these mini arcs, by sending the characters out and sort of allowing the different pieces of their character to be revealed according to these sorts of genre pieces that we've been talking about. It actually, in some ways, it makes it easier for him to then get the characters back together. We know that Cassian, for example, is going to end up back at Marva's funeral, not only because of the sentimental connection, but because all of the trajectory, all of the momentum of the different types of stories that he's been a part of are leading him back home. And you can say that for some of the other characters as well. We know that Dedra is going to end up there. We know that Cyril's going to find a way to get there. Because it's a buddy cop movie, Moscow has to be there as well. Who, by the way, we had not seen for, 7 or 8 episodes at all.
It's very funny when he gets on the phone. Yeah. Like, can you hear me?
These are the comic elements that we were talking about off camera, and what make the sort of the buddy cop insight so interesting. So I think for me, it's a pretty successful job of getting all of these characters back together, but there maybe are some ways in which it's a little
There may have been an element here or there that's strained, but I think it moves forward at such a momentum that you don't even really notice those things. Just sort of really, really briefly to think about some of the other stuff we've talked about. A funeral is a pretty important part of Battle of Algiers when they're holding the funeral for all the people who were killed in the French terrorist attack. And so there's a direct callback to a funeral as a mobilizing moment for an insurgency in what this comes from. Just sort of structurally, it really felt to me that Gilroy was motivated in a lot of ways in putting this together by the final seasons of Game of Thrones, where an effort to do this same thing just sort of collapsed upon itself, right? The pulling together all the people from this wide-ranging story that completely failed to make sense in the last season, but it was well done. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that probably concludes our discussion of the textual or on the surface elements of Andor, and we will be right back with our second segment. And we're back with our discussion of Star Wars Andor. Wait, is that its name? No, it's just Andor, isn't it?
Yes.
Is it Star Wars : Andor?
No, just Andor.
Just Andor.
Which is interesting in and of itself.
Right.
Right. That this is a story that is only peripherally set in the classic Star Wars conventional universe.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And we've discussed the textual elements, the on-the-surface elements. We're now going to discuss the mythologies which underpin the story, or which, maybe that's the wrong term, which can be brought to the story in order to maybe decode its meaning, the societal meaning structures. Jeff, we started on this channel with a couple of discussions of Star Wars texts, Rogue One and also Episode 4.
Yeah.
And we discussed a lot the hero's journey, which is sort of one of the classical myths of, I was going to actually say contemporary Western society, but that's wrong. The whole point of it is it's like the monomyth that appears in all societies is the kind of conceit of the argument there.
Right.
And do you want to maybe tell me a little bit about what the hero's journey is, and then tell me if Andor fits into this?
Yeah, the hero's journey is popularized in scholarship by the mythologist Joseph Campbell. And according to Campbell, it is, as you say, it's the kind of the human monomyth. And Campbell's argument is that this is a story of human development that one would find time out of mind across all cultures, across all eras. And it consists, the reason that it is so universal, according to Campbell, is because the story form of the hero's journey is an analogy to the ordinary human process of growing up and maturing. And so the hero's journey begins with an immature adolescent who is in a state of lack, who is missing something, or from whom something has been taken. And the journey is then the adventure out into the world in order to try to find that thing that has been taken or missing. And then once having secured it, almost always through a series of trials and tribulations that test the integrity of the would-be hero's motivations, the hero then returns home, a now complete person who has matured, and has matured in a way that is marked by a willingness to sacrifice one's own interest, one's own wants and needs for the sake of others. So it's a story that emphasizes the development of what we might call other regarding behavior, and the way in which this is an analogous process to what all human beings have to go through in order to become mature and functional and caring, full people. And we see this, you're right, one of Campbell's major examples when he's writing about the hero's journey in the 1970s is Star Wars, A New Hope. And he says this is a classic hero's journey. And so we talked a lot about that in our first pod. We also talked about in our much earlier pod on Rogue One about how Cassian Andor's story in that text is not really a hero's journey, because we don't see much in the way of this kind of transformation of character or maturation. He seems to be the same person at the beginning of the movie as he is at the end of the movie, right? That kind of self-sacrificial dedication to others is already in place. I think, on the other hand, what we get in Andor is, in fact, a fairly classic version of the hero's journey, but one with a bit of a head fake. The story starts with Cassian looking for his long-lost sister, but it turns out that is not what his journey is about at all. And in fact, it's so much so that in one of his perhaps his last conversation with Marva says, you need to stop worrying about your sister. There are no Canaries left. Yeah, that part is done. And so instead, the hero's journey is not searching for the missing totem, which is in the figure of his sister. It's rather searching for this sense of broader purpose. And it's coming to a more fine-grained understanding of the ability and the necessity to put the interests of others in front of your own wants and needs, and the ability to understand that those interests are sometimes revolutionary in nature. Sometimes those interests involve standing up to and fighting power. So I think in a lot of ways it's kind of a classic hero's journey, but it does have that element of a head fake to it.
Right. There are two things I would add to this. First, and I don't know how many people have looked at Ollie Lapointe's story from Battle of Algiers and have conceived of it as a hero story. But as in the way you lay that out, it's actually very similar, right? That Ollie Lapointe goes through many of the sort of the same stages in order to arrive at this other regarding behavior at the end, which turns him into a revolutionary terrorist. Okay, well, but I think that there is another aspect to this, and I think it's probably a little bit understudied. I know we're getting a little metatextual here, but how the prequel series really kind of inverts the hero's story in some interesting ways, right? Because there you have this figure of Anakin Skywalker, and in the end, his primary reason for turning to darkness is actually other regarding behavior. Yeah. Right, that he sort of steps out of the very particular way that he's supposed to think about others and has a particularist connection, but that's what leads him, into the literal dark side, right? That, and I've never sort of thought of that as a clever inversion of the hero's story, but I think that reading probably holds a lot of water.
That's a really interesting point, because it's not just an inversion of the hero's journey. It's a
perversion. It's kind of a
perversion, and it illustrates the degree to which that other regarding behavior can be manipulated, right, in a particularly vulnerable situation, which is what happens, of course, to Anakin, right, is that he's manipulated into this posture by Palpatine, who makes a series of promises that are dubiously true,
right?
If that. That is a clever bit of storytelling. You're right.
Okay, I have here Nemik's influence and journal.
Yeah. So so Nemik is one of the high schools.
Because a particularly unsubtle prompt, by the way. I just read the bullet point on the sheet of paper. So, tell me if you will about the character of Nemik. Yeah. What do you see as his influence, and how does his journal play into that?
Yeah. So Nemik is one of our heist figures, and he's very young. He's quite inexperienced in matters of violence and insurrection, clearly. But he's a bit of I don't know, if like a philosopher king or a poet king, maybe. And he has been working on this reflection, this journal, this revolutionary text. And he gifts it at his death, he gifts it to Cassian Andor. Because when Cass first meets Nemik, he is still very, very cynical about the nature of power and the ability of ordinary people to contest power in a way that would be effective or meaningful in any way. And so for Nemik, that gifting is maybe it's an act of hope or an act of promise, in which he's very much hoping that Cassian, he clearly sees something in Cassian, almost like a proto-revolutionary or ideological figure. And it's clear that he's hoping that this journal will get Cass to grow and to mature into the sort of person that Nemik and Marva, by the way, also believes that he is destined to be. And the journal, he turns out to be correct. Right? The journal does turn out to be important.
Right. And having watched it again a second or possibly even a third time, the first two times I was inclined to dismiss a lot of the content in the journal as, just sort of the kind of pan-ideological freedom is good, pablum, that is necessary to move the plot forward, but isn't particularly interesting. But the last time I listened to it, there is some actual interesting content there, right? And it comes down to one turn of phrase that I particularly liked, which is that tyranny is hard, right? That tyranny is unnatural because it's difficult, right? Look at how hard they have to work at doing this, right? That tells us that there's something fundamentally wrong about what they're doing, that it takes them so much to impose this particular understanding. And I think that maybe leads a little bit into our next conversation, which, will be about, what does ideology matter in this world, right? What do we mean when we say the Republic and the Empire and the New Republic? What is actually the difference in ideological content between those systems, which Andor is certainly willing to interrogate, right? And maybe not deeply, but it's willing to tell us that there are issues.
And there's also an analog there in that vision of tyranny is hard, oppression is difficult, and it's the mask of fear, as Nemik says, precisely because you have to work so hard. It's so unnatural. There's an analog to what Cassian says in prison when he is trying to motivate or lead this prison break. And he says, power doesn't panic. And that's how you know that this whole thing is creaky. That's how you know that the whole thing is just, thrown together with baling wire and bubble gum, so to speak. And you wonder if, I think it's unlikely that Cassian has come to that perspective without the aid of the journal,
Right.
which he has had in his possession now for some time. And so that's the other interesting bit of his hero's journey, is that really where the hinge and the character development really occurs is when Cassian is imprisoned unjustly and without trial, and he's literally forced to work in solidarity with others for the first time. And that is those are the moments, that's the arc in a lot of ways. That's maybe the central character arc for him.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about a point you made, Professor Farley, in your article, where you pointed out that Diego Luna was his sort of background or ethnicity was important in making a particular point about who Cassian Andor was, and that almost all the humans in Star Wars had been either American sounding or if they were the villains, they were British sounding. And to actually have someone for whom English was a second language was making an important point. Maybe the meaning structure of the kind of colonized other was brought to the fore by that piece of casting.
Yeah, and it had occurred to us, and we'd had a conversation about this before, but pretty sure that this is that the depiction of Canary and is it Canarans? I don't know, but
Canaries, I think.
Canaries.
Not canaries.
This is the first time in Star
Not
Wars.
the coal mine.
You're not in the coal mine anymore, Dorothy. Dedra. You ain't in the coal mine anymore, Dedra.
Speaking of mining disasters, this is
A real froze transition.
I know, well done, Rob.
This is the first time in the Star Wars, at least in the live action, where humans have been depicted as indigenous, right? There are indigenous peoples in Star Wars as long as there's been Star Wars. The Sand people are indigenous. The Ewoks, Wookiees to some extent, are stand-ins for indigenous people. But I think, and this is at considerable tension with sort of other fictional universes, like, for example, Star Trek, where they meet a new group of indigenous humans every single week. Mm-hmm. This is the first time that they have depicted, or I would say Dune, right, where the indigenous Fremen are an enormous plot point, right, and who are clearly indicated as indigenous in the text. This is the first time in Star Wars that we have seen humans as indigenous people, right? Humans as, to use the term primitive, but that carry sort of all the indicators of primitive, low technology, people who are existing in this universe and yet are nonetheless human. Mm-hmm. And that Cassian is one of these people, I think, opens up an entire universe of different potential meanings for the rebellion, right? Not just for the rebellion, but for the Galactic Civil War. Because Luke Skywalker, fundamentally in the end, I suppose he is the descendant of slaves, right? But, fundamentally in the end, he's an American white guy, right? And Cassian Andor is something different. And that gives you a lot of space for exploring different kinds of stories associated with empire and colonialism and rebellion.
And he's other to the colonial imagination, which is one of the reasons why maybe he doesn't, for the longest time in his character arc, makes essentially no distinction between different types of overwhelming oppressive power. They're all the same, right? So, the mining disaster is almost certainly caused by corporate mining guild characters, who probably wear something approximating a uniform.
Right.
The accident that takes place with the ship on Canary, right, is, as you had pointed out, Rob, is not an Imperial vessel at all, but rather a Republic vessel. And so it's Republic officers who kill his friends and colleagues. And then it's Imperial officers and corporate officers. First it's corpos and then Imperials, all of them wearing it. So it's just one uniform after another. And so when Luthen is first trying to recruit him in that opening arc, the cynicism of Cass is very well grounded, right? It's all the same. It's just different, slightly different uniforms, but they all do the same stuff. And he is other to all of them.
Right. What is the point of sacrificing to bring back the Republic when it is the Republic that destroyed my homeworld in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the maybe the last point I wanted to talk about in this section on mythologies, on societal meaning structures, maybe it's only me who was taken by this, but in rewatching Battle of Algiers, there was the speech given about the tapeworm, and how, fighting an insurgency is like cutting bits off a tapeworm. And unless you destroy all the bits of the tapeworm or the head or whatever it was, I don't remember the insectology involved here, the thing would just regrow. And I thought that was a really interesting way to think about Andor and Rogue One, which has a problem to solve in that obviously none of these people were significant actors beyond the events of Rogue One, because otherwise we would have seen them in the movies. And so there's, the tapeworm analogy in Battle of Algiers, which suggests that, rebels come and rebels go, and the key thing is the overarching structure that can regrow itself, is a kind of nice way to think about how that plot problem is solved, like organically, in a way that's not crude, but in Rogue One and in Andor, in a way that the kind of form of the storytelling really fits with the specific in-world thing that is going on, which is the building of a rebellion.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it goes. We talked about this a little bit in the Rogue One pod about the idea of the self-disassembling machine.
Well, that's Jerry Canavan's phrase, the science fiction studies scholar, who said, Rogue One neatly disassembles itself at the end of the movie, which is the only way you could do that kind of prequel.
And which also points us to something that might be different about season 2. We're now seeing these characters having some contact now with more legacy characters in the Star Wars universe. In season 1, the only legacy character is Mon Mothma.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it'll be interesting to see if that changes the character or the tone or the tenor of the series, and if so, how exactly?
I feel like in the trailer for season 2 that we watched, you see, what do you see? You see the Emperor. You see like the Death Star is alluded to. That you hear Darth Vader's. I'm not sure you see him, but you hear the noise, and you do wonder how much of this is kind of, I don't know what you call it, trailer bait. Like it's there's a new Star Wars product. What are people going to want to see? They're going to want to see Darth Vader, and you wonder how central that's going to be to season 2 of Andor. I do worry a little bit though that if they made it really kind of original trilogy Star Wars, they're going to actually undermine the thing that has made Andor so interesting.
Right. And I have the same concern. There's something else I want to add that actually connects both of these points together, which, I think for the longest time we did kind of understand the Star Wars world as a linear world, right? That you went from Republic, and then there was a story of the rise of the Empire, then the Empire fell and was replaced by the New Republic, right? And the sequel trilogy is off in the future and changes that understanding quite a bit. But for Andor, it is just really cyclical, right? For him, that he's not necessarily part of this linear story of history developing in a certain way. And this calls back to Battlestar Galactica, which had a very explicitly cyclical story that, this happens before, it happens again, and so forth. When you watch Andor, you are inclined to think, maybe I'm not in a linear story anymore. Maybe I'm in a cyclical story. Now, and I would also say, like much of the controversy associated with the 8th film is basically Luke Skywalker being suddenly surprised to learn that he's in a cyclical story and not in a linear story. And that so much of like his difficulty as a character, but also with the difficulty of the audience of understanding what's happening to that character, can be captured by what kind of story am I really in, and how is this going to develop in a way that maybe I haven't anticipated.
Rob, those are deep questions. They sound like they're verging on, we're right at the threshold of the world of critique. What do you think, Jeff? I smell critique. And it's not just what you had for lunch. We're leaving that in, by the way. That is not coming out. I mean, this is not smell-o-vision on the pod.
I only wish I wasn't so taken aback that I had something snappy that I could say back to you.
Well,
as usual,
we've been in this position before.
As usual, you've left me speechless.
Okay, I think this signals then the end of a section. And we are back with our discussion of Andor. We are now into our third section, the section that we call critique, where we look at maybe some ways that the text, appends what is expected. Maybe we offer a counter reading of the text, try and subvert it. There's lots of things we could do in this section. What is it we are going to do, though, Jeff?
Well, why don't we pick up with where we left off, this notion of Andor and the Star Wars universe in storytelling universe in general, telling a kind of cyclical story of regime change, a cyclical story of violence and domination and resistance, in a way that is at war with the more common Western story form telling of a linear progress of history in which you start off oppressed and you end up eventually at the maximal point of freedom and liberty. Because we see that very clearly, I think Rob is right, in Andor. And I think it's probably not a coincidence that we see it so clearly in this text, precisely because it's a text that is told predominantly from the perspective of ordinary people. And ordinary people who are most subjected on a daily basis to the vicissitudes of power in all of its forms, and who therefore tend to see it and have a kind of familiarity and a clear-eyed vision of what it means to be at the asymmetrical bottom of a power relationship. And for those people, it's going to be very difficult to distinguish different types of power. And you can understand just why it is that Cass is so cynical, right? He's not only speaking for himself, he's speaking for a great many of his compatriots, for sure, in those first couple of arcs. And one of the marks of his maturity is his ability to distinguish between different types of power, and to understand that different regimes of power are better and worse, and that there's something about the Empire that is even worse than the forms of power that he's encountered before.
Yeah, and it strikes me, too, that one could develop, and I don't think I've read this, but one could develop sort of a very strong post-colonial anti-liberal critique of Andor on this basis, right? That, in the end, all we're coming to, and this is to borrow a concept from a phrase from American politics, we are simply choosing the lesser of two evils. Right, and to describe any conversation that includes Sheev Palpatine as he's slightly the greater of two evils, right? I think he'd be offended by that. I really am the greater of two evils, but there's this intelligible story to be told here that Andor of all people should understand that the distinction between Republic and Empire is not enough, right? That the rebellion needs to be something more than simply reestablishing the Republic, because the Republic was rotten. The Republic was rotten. Perhaps, and certainly for Andor himself, the Empire is worse because he has to go to prison. But it seems to me that he is a character that could carry and could bear the load of a much more radical interpretation of this, which sort of says more, this is more about breaking this cyclical nature than simply choosing whoever the least of the evils is this particular time. And I suppose a really radical interpretation might be to see a figure like Cassian Andor as a founder of the First Order down the line, right? As someone who becomes so dismayed and disenchanted with the liberalism of the New Republic that he simply decides, well, actually, fascism isn't the worst.
Yeah. In terms of the absence of magic it was very noticeable in Rogue One, and it really changed the kind of tone and meaning, I think, of what Star Wars was. And there'd been a bit of that in The Last Jedi as well, hadn't there? The story was centered, or it ended quite famously with someone sweeping up and the suggestion that was the future of the rebellion. It wasn't any more of the kind of elite lineages. But it's in Rogue One that you really see the kind of ordinary person, the person who's not force sensitive or force accomplished or whatever the word would be, taking center stage. That's definitely true in Andor. I mean, it's really in that universe. Do we see any manifestations of anything or allusions to the Force? I don't think we do at all, do we?
You certainly hear "May the Force be with you" is in Rogue One. I do not remember if anyone says "May the Force be with you" in Andor.
I would have stood out like a sore thumb.
I think that's right, Stephen. I can't recall any reference at all to force-bearing people, the Force as a thing, or religion at all.
Right. Well, no, you do get references to religion. You get some discussion. This is what's sort of interesting about Aldani, or not, well, both Aldani and Maeve's world. Like there does appear to be indigenous religion in both places, and there are religious and traditionalist practices in both places, but they have nothing to do with the Force. They have nothing to do with Jedi.
But the absence of the Force is really sort of important from a critique standpoint, because it changes Star Wars from being a text that's essentially fantasy into being a text that's science fiction, and it allows Star Wars to fulfill the traditional role of science fiction, which is to at the same time as kind of alienating or estranging you from reality, showing that your reality might not be the only reality. It also centers ordinary human agency in a way that fantasy doesn't. So that's often taken as quite a revolutionary thing to do. You show people that they're very important, and you show that the circumstances in which they exist are not the only possible circumstances. You've therefore created a text that is pointing towards revolutionary change. I wonder if we want to dig into that a little bit, or if it's just kind of self-explanatory points.
No, I think it's interesting. I wonder how that maps on, as you say, to the question of utopian potential, right? Which is something I know that you're very interested in, Stephen. I mean, it piggybacks on something you just said, Rob, that maybe Cassian could be that revolutionary figure who maybe breaks a cycle of repetitive violence, right, and points to something like a utopian circumstance. I mean,
right.
Is that something that can really only happen in a kind of genre of ordinary people, a science fiction genre, rather than a fantasy genre where the focus is always upon heroes, larger than life heroes?
Right.
It's so interesting, but we also, yes, I think that's true, but also we get back into the problem of prequels. And this is a prequel of a prequel, which is, we know that Cassian is not ultimately the revolutionary figure. We know how this happens for all these people, and how it happens at all. Let me pose this as a question rather than a statement. Does it perhaps undermine that revolutionary agentic perspective that we actually know that the next step in the story is where all the princesses and elites kind of take over, and they really do drive the story? This is literally a prelude or a prequel. The main action is to come. Yeah. Does that undermine?
I think so. I think it does. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, nobody came in and saved Algeria with a lightsaber, right? That it required, and Algeria has still not been saved. Yeah.
But if there was a contemporary remake of Battle of Algiers by an American studio, maybe that's what it would be. It'd be like shot for shot, and then in the last 5 minutes, it's like, this hasn't been lively enough. Let's get like a lightsaber out, or Abrams tank, you know. Someone should make that movie. That's copyright, by the way. I've played that now, so you can't have that. All right, guys. Anything else you want to say on critique? I mean, we could move to critics, which sounds like critique.
Let's move to critics.
Okay, so there was one, I think, quite provocative quote that I wanted to throw out and see if it got you guys going. This is by David Cleon in The New Republic. It says here on Rotten Tomatoes he is a top critic. Yes. So that's great. Well done, David. The quote is this: "The show deserves to be seen as great TV in the same league as shows like The Wire and The Sopranos." I suppose this is a version of our temperature check question we often ask at the start, but we're asking at the end now through the eyes of a critic, or the words of a critic. Are we buying that? Is Andor really top tier television? Wire, Sopranos, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, that kind of tier?
I think it is.
Okay.
And I think it's more accomplished than some of those shows that you just mentioned.
Okay. Which one of those greats are you putting it above?
I think it's better than Mad Men.
Okay.
And
wow.
I'm
He's
not
gone big there.
I think it's likely better than The Sopranos as well.
Oh my goodness.
I think it's a much richer text than either of those.
Rob.
I think
crazy, right? I mean, it's not. You do well. I should pose as a question. Do you see this as very top tier?
So this season, and I think it would be more helpful, and I found it more helpful when I am thinking about the golden age of television, to think rather in terms of series, to be thinking in terms of seasons, right? And so that allows you to import something like Westworld, right, which is an incredibly uneven show, but where the first season, to some extent, the second season are every bit as good as some of these golden age. And so what we have with Andor, we have an absolutely fabulous first season, right? And I do think it is competitive. I wouldn't call it better or worse necessarily, but it's competitive with all these other Golden Age shows. And I would say the closest it's to is The Wire, right? That it feels, there's so much of this that feels very much like The Wire to me. But we're about to get to a second season, and it's going to be something that's much different. And I don't even know if it's going to be, I don't know if we're going to be able to use the same kind of vocabulary to talk about the second season, which is very much going to be a Star Wars show, is what it looks like, as opposed to what we saw in this first season. You know, what I will say is that this demonstrates that anytime you have this really big IP, you actually can go off in a small corner of this universe and tell awfully interesting stories. Right, really good stories that are not weighed down by all of sort of the colossal existence of everything else that's associated, right? Whether it's Star Trek or the MCU or whatever else. But that, you can go small and you can produce something that is really world class in terms of quality.
Yeah, I'll give you guys like top tier Star Wars is where I stand on this.
Okay,
like it's amongst the very best. You know, for me, entries in that canon. I'm not quite there on, you know, best ever in the history of all television territory.
Again, I think it eclipses its origins as a Star Wars story, and I'm curious as to what other Star Wars properties you would put in this category, because
like Rogue One, I thought was really good.
So I guess I would consider Rogue One and Andor to be in the same. They're doing this. It's the same in a lot of ways. Right. But other than Rogue One.
No, they're in the top tier. But you know I don't like this franchise, so I haven't even talked about it for an hour odd, and I'm just not that. You know, I'm most interested in Rogue One and Andor because they fundamentally subvert the premises of the franchise, and they bring it closer to things that I am more interested in. Rob, you're a big Battlestar Galactica fan. You let this slip earlier. Well, let it slip. You proudly proclaimed it. I mean, you didn't shout it from the... You're not a lunatic, but I should say, you mentioned it earlier, that you like Battlestar Galactica. I would consider Battlestar Galactica like clearly majorly superior to Andor. Are you buying that one?
I would be reluctant to agree with that, and I'll even go ahead and explain why.
Slapped all around.
So no. That most people who watch Battlestar Galactica, including myself, and maybe not you, but most people forget that in every 20-episode arc, there were like 6 episodes that were terrible. Right, and that this was true of every season, except you had to add one. Right, it's number of terrible episodes plus the season number is the number of terrible episodes that are going to be in each season. Right, and but it's, you know, even in the first season there are episodes that go nowhere, that characterizations that don't make sense. And so, you know, you can remember all of the very best parts of Battlestar Galactica, and they are truly amazing. But if you were watching it on a week-to-week basis, it was kind of hit and miss. Right? There were times where there were very clear misses that Andor hasn't had so far.
Well, but so let me be more specific then. If you think that of times those two shows were telling not dissimilar stories, right? So there's the Occupation Exodus arc, you know, to do with New Caprica in Battlestar, where there's a lot of things are going on that would not be out of place in Andor or out of place in Battle of Algiers. I would suggest that was clearly superior to Andor.
Well, and I would be willing to entertain an argument that the first 3 hours of Battlestar Galactica, which is the miniseries plus 33, which is really the inaugural episode, are as strong or better than anything that was Andor or anything that is in the entire Star Wars universe. Right, it's very militarized sci-fi. Even in the later scenes, I think that the story of the coup d'etat in the fleet is very well told. The attempted coup d'etat in the fleet is very well told. So they could still tell some of these stories later in Battlestar Galactica. But I found a clear deterioration of the storytelling as the series went on.
And this is going to become, if we don't stop this soon, it's going to become a Battlestar Galactica pod. But it's just occurring to me while you're talking that, you know, another thing I found interesting as Battlestar went on, and I think a lot of people didn't like this, but they did kind of hit the mythical or religious or supernatural elements a little harder in a way that was odd or that seemed odd to some people or alienating to some people because it had been so hyper-realistic and so militarized in its early iterations. But I kind of liked that you ended up with multiple plausible explanations for things that were were going on. But I wonder if, maybe we don't want to finish this up 'cause it's going to take us in the wrong direction, or open up a new front in this pod war. But you do wonder if Battlestar was
begun. These pod wars have.
Yes, if Battlestar was starting to actually allude to some Force type elements, or nod to some fantasy kind of directions, particularly in its 4th season, which assumed this supernatural background. I don't know. Maybe that's a thought I should just leave out there. Maybe there's no.
I feel like it deserves additional exploration. But how many science fiction franchises sort of actually maintain their sort of really clear commitment to remaining science fiction? Because even Star Trek gets a little sketchy at certain times about whether it's science fiction or whether it's fantasy.
Right, and you do run into, and Andor, if it went on for enough seasons, would run into the same problem. Well, it'd run into a big practical problem, which is Diego Luna's going to keep getting older, and we've seen him when he's supposed to be older in universe,
right?
And we know he's dead, and he should have been dead 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But all these series run into the classic problem that there's only so many stories you can tell within that world, and you can see all of these series do the episode where they all get drunk, and they do the episode where there's a coup, and they do the episode blah blah blah, and you run out very quickly of the archetypal story.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, I think since I've started talking about another show entirely, and I'm threatening to do so at some length, this might be a time
to conclude.
Time to apply the old guillotine, which I saw in Battle of Algiers. Actually, that's what's called a callback. And so I think we should say thank you to Professor Rob Farley for visiting us. We've really enjoyed having you on the pod. Thank you, Jeff, as always, for your marginal contribution. And
happy to oblige.
And on that bombshell.